what is biodiversity net gain? So net gain is an approach to development that aims to leave the natural environment in a measurably better state than it was beforehand. And you can, in terms of what we have available now, you can deliver biodiversity net gain on site, and that tends to be delivered by habitat creation enhancement through landscaping and green infrastructure, for example, on site, or it can be delivered off site. And that would be habitat creation enhancement on land holdings or potentially via habitat banks. And you can have a mixture of those two. The preference is always for on-site. That is the kind of preferred option, but obviously that's not always possible. And we've just got a little poll come up. Hopefully you can see that in your on Zoom, and that's just to ask you guys whether you're already involved in any delivery of biodiversity net gain in your area. So we know that some councils are and some aren't, and there's already it's already being encouraged, but through national planning policy ahead of it becoming mandatory. So we're just interested to know if you guys are already doing anything along those lines. Okay, so I'm just going to leave that poll open and move on to the next slide. So if it's in your way, like it is for me, you should be able to just pick up the window and move it across. Okay, so if we click onto the next slide and get it to work, there we go. So why biodiversity net gain? So we know that biodiversity is declining. There's been a recent study that said that over the last 70 years, we've lost 50% of biodiversity worldwide. And in this country, that's despite having policies for no net loss. So we've got the Natural Environment and Rural Communities Act that's been in place for several years. And we've also got policies, the National Planning Policy Framework has set that up for a number of years around no net loss for biodiversity. And we're aware, obviously, of the climate emergencies and biodiversity emergencies that are being declared. So it's really a time to be more ambitious. So I guess that's a sort of official reason, probably the reason that DEFRA would put forward and Natural England if we're thinking about it. But what about for you as local authorities? That may be enough priority in itself, but I think it's important to think about how biodiversity net gain fits in with some of the other stuff that you're trying to deliver as local authorities. So there's the link into delivering the public realm and green infrastructure, and particularly around placemaking and making better places for people. And that also links into the active travel agenda. The other side of it is it can act as a potential income stream. So particularly if you get, if you can set up something around habitat banking and offsite delivery, some local authorities that are already doing this have discovered it can set up a really good income stream around these aspects. And then there's the link into other agendas. So I already mentioned climate change, but also flood resilience. So it's not necessarily thinking about, yes, it is this new requirement, but it hopefully will fit in with a lot of what you're already doing and thinking about as a local authority. And it's not necessarily, and that's probably going to be a really good way to sort of think about it and deliver it, is by fitting it in with other aspects and linking into other aspects relating to the natural environment and placemaking. Okay. So I think we've got most of the polls up there. So we've just shared the results. So we've got quite a mix in the room, which is really good to, so you can see there the results of the poll. We've got sort of almost half and half really in terms of already doing some stuff and not already doing some stuff. So that's really great. So obviously we were aware that there's a range across the country. So it's really good that we've got a real mix in the room to get your perspectives on how it's going and what help you need. Okay, brilliant. Right, so on to the next slide, if I can click it on. There we go. Right, so in terms of what's going on now, biodiversity net gain, we've got the government's 25-year environment plan, which sets out an aspiration to embed biodiversity net gain in the planning system, but also an aspiration to move more towards a natural capital approach, so bringing in other elements around the benefits of nature as well as biodiversity. The National Planning Policy Framework sets out a requirement to achieve biodiversity net gain where possible. And that's also backed up by the Natural Environment Planning Practice Guidance, which actually offers a lot of information about how biodiversity net gain can be implemented. There's also that same policy requirement in the both the National Infrastructure Commission's and MHCLG's design guides, and in the national policy statements. So there's a lot of sort of policy backing in terms of biodiversity net gain. And we've also got a metric which allows us to measure biodiversity net gain, the 2.0 metric. What I should have said earlier on is we're going to share these slides, so you know, don't worry that you're not, you know, we will share those, so you will have those for later. Okay, so that's what we've got now. What about what's coming? The Environment Bill. So the Environment Bill covers a range of issues. It covers air quality, waste, waste and resources, nature and biodiversity, and also conservation covenants. And it sets up an Office for Environmental Protection. And it brings in particular new requirements for local authorities on nature and biodiversity. So it brings in local nature recovery strategies, biodiversity net gain, which is going to be the sort of focus of today. There's going to be a strengthened biodiversity duty on public authorities. It brings in some legislation around strategic protected sites and species strategies, and also new tree felling consultation requirements. So there's quite a lot in there that relates to you guys and your work. So in terms of biodiversity net gain and mandatory biodiversity net gain, what are the key things that are coming out in terms of what's in the Environment Bill? It applies to England only. It's going to amend the Town and Country Planning Act. The requirement is a minimum of 10% gain, and that will have to be calculated using this biodiversity metric. And in terms of planning permission, that will require approval of a net gain plan alongside permission, or in order to secure permission. Habitat will need to be secured for at least 30 years, and that would be by planning obligations or these new conservation covenants. It can be delivered on-site or off-site, as we talked about before, but there's also going to be some new statutory biodiversity credits. There will be a national register for net gain delivery sites. But in terms of the current system, it maintains that mitigation hierarchy. So where you're talking about impacts, environmental impacts, you should always avoid those first. Then if you can't avoid them, you mitigate for them, and only as a last resort compensate. So that's very much maintained in terms of the biodiversity net gain approach. It doesn't apply to NSIPs, and it doesn't apply to marine development at the moment. And it doesn't change any existing legal environmental and wildlife protection. So things like protected species, it doesn't change any of the requirements in relation to those. So just because you've dealt with net gain aspects doesn't mean some of those other bits and pieces are ticked off, although they can be, you know, it can help in terms of doing that. So I mentioned that there's this additional option there in terms of delivery of biodiversity net gain around the statutory credits. So we already talked about the, you know, you can have it on-site preferably, otherwise off-site, and there can be a combination of those. And then if the availability isn't there for either of those, and that has to be demonstrated, there will be a new statutory credit system. And the important thing to note on that is that's not going to be locally specific, or it's very unlikely to be locally specific. So in terms of delivery for you and your area and your local authority, it's usually going to be preferable to deliver on site and you know, off site locally, rather than buy into the statutory credit system. And the idea is that the system will basically, it'll basically price things so that it should be, although it will be accessible to developers, it shouldn't price you out of basically delivering locally as a preference, if that makes sense. And it will deliver landscape scale strategic habitat creation and linked into nature-based solutions. Okay, so I mentioned nature recovery strategies. These are something that is also covered in the bill alongside biodiversity net gain. Um, the intention is that these would be partnership-led, locally developed spatial strategies for nature, and they'll work within a national framework. So they will identify opportunities and priorities for enhancing the natural environment. And they inform and underpin the proposed national nature recovery network. So they feed into that. And the key link really in terms of biodiversity net gain is that they can be used to target biodiversity net gain delivery. So used to think about where particular habitats may be targeted and things. Okay, so I've set out the kind of what's happening and what we know in overarching terms in terms of the Environment Bill. There is a lot of detail that comes underneath that in terms of how these things are actually going to work. So we've got the broad principles, we know what broadly happening, but when it comes into the detail, and a lot of that will be really important for you in terms of implementing the system, because that will be, you know, what you need to know in order to put it into policy and make planning decisions. So a lot of that will come through in terms of secondary legislation and regulations. So we already know that there's all sorts of things on the sort of secondary legislation list. So that includes things around this net gain plan. So details on how are you going to go about approving that, what factors need to be considered, and also appeals in relation to net gain plans. There are going to need to be amendments to the planning register. There is consideration going on around exemptions. So what doesn't need to apply biodiversity net gain, what types of development. Degradation, so that's around where if developers basically degrade a site before applying for planning permission, you know, so potentially they could end up with a lower biodiversity level on the site than it had before they, you know, beforehand. Irreplaceable habitats. So irreplaceable habitats don't come into the biodiversity net gain scheme because they're too valuable. They shouldn't really be being destroyed. So there will be definitions of what those are. So things like ancient woodland would be included on that, but there'll be some more probably on that list. Net gain register. So this is around this register of sites. How is that going to work? And then also around additionality or stacking, depending on what you call it. So this is around the issue of if you've got habitat being provided for other reasons, so for mitigation or compensation for other reasons. So for example, for protected species, you might have some habitat being provided for protected species. How do you account for that alongside biodiversity net gain and make sure you're getting enough habitat that ticks the boxes for both of those? And then there'll be some details around particular permissions. So permissions granted onto particular sections of the Town and Country Planning Act, how you deal with amendments to planning permissions, and also phased development, which will obviously be slightly different. Okay, so that's what we know in terms of what's already set out, but what does this mean for you and what does it mean for us? And where do we start with this? So we already know from the poll we did that some of you are already doing it or doing bits of it, and some of you are not doing it. So how do we even start in terms of thinking about this? And what more do we need? If you're already doing something, what more do you need to do? And how do you get from where you are, from A to B? What does it really mean? So in terms of the timescales, this is what we know. We know that under current timescales, it's intended that mandatory biodiversity net gain would be required from autumn 2023. So coming up very soon this summer, we've got we're expecting there to be a consultation from DEFRA, both on local nature recovery strategies, but also on some of the secondary legislation. So some of the things I've just mentioned, the detail around those. So that consultation will be coming out in the next few months. There have been some pilots running across the country, I think 5 pilots of local nature recovery strategies, and we're expecting a report of those, which will be really useful in terms of setting out how those have worked. I know that they've been looking at how they fit in with local plans, for example, and in some of the areas they do have biodiversity net gain schemes in place, so that will be really helpful, hopefully, in providing a bit of info. There's going to be a British standard for biodiversity net gain, that will set out some details around how you can do it. So again, that's coming out in the next month. So again, hopefully add a bit more useful guidance. And the biodiversity metric 2.0 is also being updated. So there are quite a lot of issues with the current biodiversity metric in the way it deals with some bits and pieces. Those have been taken on board, and there's a new version. And there's also going to be a specific metric for small development sites. So sort of less onerous. That's going to be a beta version of that. So testing. So that will be available in the next month or so. We're just waiting for a release date on that. Okay, and then come the autumn, we're expecting the Environment Bill to get its royal assent. And also, hopefully, we'll have a few more details on how this statutory credit scheme is going to work. Spring next year, we'll have the response to the consultation. So we'll have all the information about that secondary legislation. We should have the response to that and how it's actually going to work. And also a bit later in the spring, it's expected that the local nature recovery strategies will be rolled out. And then the following year, spring 2023, so 6 months before Biodiversity Net Gain becomes mandatory, the digital site register should be in place, and also this statutory credit service as well. So those things will be ready 6 months in advance. Okay, so that's what we know about what's coming and when it's coming. We also know that Natural England and DEFRA are doing a lot of work at the moment to get ready and to sort out some of these details. So we might not know exactly what the decisions are and what the details are, but we know there's work going in to do those. So Natural England are working with local authorities locally, but also DEFRA have got quite a lot of steering groups and things, getting input from local authorities in terms of the policy side of things. And they're engaging across government and with other organisations like SIEM, IEMA, the Local Government Association, ALGI, the Association of Local Government Ecologists, to get input around how this is best going to work. They're working on this statutory credit scheme and including who will run it. We don't know who will run it yet. And Natural England are also doing some work around digital platforms for the register and credit scheme and how those might work. So DEFRA are looking at new burdens. So this is going to be really important for you guys. There's a recognition that the Environment Bill will bring new burdens for you and you'll need additional resources. And they're just working through what that's going to look like in terms of additional resources for local authorities. Recently completed a survey led by the Association of Local Government Ecologists and the Association of Directors of Environment Planning and Transport to help inform that. So that went out to all local authorities across the country and got a really high response rate. So that will help inform that. So we should hopefully hear something soon around that side of things. There'll also be they're working on some advice around these conservation covenants and how they relate to planning obligations and conditions, which is going to be really key. And then details around local nature recovery strategies, including responsible authorities. So the idea is that there'll be a responsible authority identified to produce a local nature recovery strategy at the county or city region level, is it the expectation, but the whole of the country needs to be covered with no overlaps in terms of geography. So that's being worked on at the moment. So we know that's happening. And then I guess we come back to the question again of, well, okay, fine. What does that mean for us though? So one of the things we've been doing at PAS is trying to think about the journey that you guys might be on. And we know that you're probably perhaps in different places on that journey in terms of thinking around biodiversity net gain. And we sort of thought about, well, how does that work in terms of a process? How does this all look? So Natural England's also been doing some thinking about this, but in a broader sense, not necessarily focused at local authorities. And this is one sort of logic model that they've come up with around how this all works in terms of the system and biodiversity net gain. But in terms of the thinking for you, there's obviously some really specific elements. And my colleague Gareth and I have been having a few chats with local authorities around the country, just to understand what's already being done and to learn a bit from where we've got best practice and where things are already being done around how did that start and how did you get going on this? And we you know, what we've sort of come up with is a little bit of a journey. It's not perfect yet, and we're hoping to add to that through your feedback and sort of think about it a bit more. But we're hoping this might help in terms of some of this thinking. So it's around, how do you get to the point in the bottom right hand corner where we've got mandatory biodiversity net gain in place, and we recognise that you'll all be in different places on that journey. I think one of the really interesting things that we've had in terms of perspective is from places like, for example, Plymouth City Council, where they've got a really good biodiversity net gain approach in place, and also talking to the LGA in London, is around thinking about this in terms of placemaking. So I mentioned that already, and thinking it in terms of how the environment fits in terms of your growth agenda and your wider planning agenda, and starting from that point perhaps, rather than delving into the detail. So obviously, in terms of getting to this place, you know, ideally you will have that sorted out through your local plan, and that will require some form of evidence base. You may already have that in place for various reasons, and it will probably link into things like green infrastructure strategies. So we've also got, you will also need to think about a biodiversity net gain policy, and probably some local distinctiveness in that policy, and an agreed target. So what are you going to aim for? Are you going to aim for 10% or go for more than that? And an agreed metric. So how are you going to measure it? And obviously we've got the biodiversity metric now, so that would probably be the best thing to use. Although we know that other, you know, some local authorities that started on this early have got their own metrics worked through. Some local authorities have got detailed guidance around that with an SPD to just add a bit more info, and that may be its own SPD or maybe part of a sort of wider natural environment SPD. But also in terms of this off-site delivery, so it's likely that you won't get all your delivery of biodiversity net gain on site. So how is that going to work strategically? Where are you going to want to put biodiversity net gain? And this links into the local nature recovery strategies as well. And again, you may already have something in place that sort of moves towards that kind of approach. And then it comes to actually deciding planning applications and dealing with planning permissions. How do you, what do you need in order to make decisions? And Greater Manchester Combined Authority have done quite a lot of work in terms of thinking around this, around validation checklists, and what you need to do in order to assess biodiversity net gain. Some local authorities have standard biodiversity net gain conditions. So Lichfield, for example, where they've got a biodiversity net gaining policy, have those, and maybe even a template for Section 106 agreements. So those might be things to think about. And then it comes to the actual delivery, which is obviously what we want to see. You know, how is this actually going to deliver on the site? And there'll need to be assessment of sites for what's already on there, potentially local authority managed habitat banks, but also third party. There might be potential for third party offsite delivery and broking. And I think this is one of the important things I wanted to note about this project. So we're here to help you, and we want to give you information to help you. But one of the other things we can do is we can share information back to Natural England and DEFRA around the policy. You know, it's still, so in some ways it's a bit scary because we don't have a lot of the detail, but it also means that we can feed in from what you guys already know and what you've learned and what you're worried about to help in developing that policy. So I'm actually going to run another poll now, and it is, if I can get it to what am I doing? Here we go. That's it. So this is quite specific, and it's around this brokerage side of things, and it's something that Natural England are interested in knowing from local authorities. Yeah, I'll sort of keep on talking while you have a look at that. But it's just really around this off-site delivery and how that might work and whether you see a role for yourselves in that. So if you can answer those questions, but I think it's important to note that we will be, you know, this is a two-way conversation in terms of this. It's not just us telling you guys stuff. It's about feeding that back and making the system work for all of us. And then obviously in terms of that delivery, we've got this statutory credit system, how on earth is that going to work? And also then in terms of monitoring, which is going to be really important, you know, so how do we know this is, we know what we want to deliver, how do we know it's actually happened and it's actually delivered?